Okay, now we're on the record. As you know, Juan was going to share his optimizing Access and SQL Server presentation. Whatever came up in his business, he wasn't able to. So I decided I would bring this little presentation that I have. I have been sitting on it for a while because it's not really that complete and not really that involved. But I thought, well, I'll just try it out here and see what happens. And then we can discuss whatever you want to discuss. And I've actually we may get, I've been talking to the team leader over there, Mike Aldridge, about doing a presentation on Dataverse and the Access connector for Dataverse. So hopefully in the next couple of months that will happen.
Great. So it sounds like you're keeping busy.
I'm staying busier than I want to. Yeah. So all know each other. These go out on YouTube and we get seen hundreds of times sometimes. So very quickly, if you just want to, who you are, what your connection to Access is, really just real short, couple of sentences for our viewing.
You want us to introduce ourselves?
Yeah, just really quickly, and what your connection to Access is. Like I say, this goes into YouTube, and so when people are
Right.
seeing this, just who they're looking at.
Do you want me to start?
Go. Yes, please.
Okay. So I've been in IT approximately 60 years, and I've been doing Access for a little more than 25 years, I guess. So Access 1. I use all the versions. And that's my story.
Kent?
Well, I just threw out my Access 97 disk. I started with Access back in version 2. So I'm primarily a business analyst, but going and talking to business owners, and I deal exclusively with small business, not interested in big business, and implementing their procedures and their workflows and what have you. There just isn't a better tool to do it than Access. So, as a business analyst, I went, well, yeah, I don't care about what the IT people think. This is really the most effective way of doing it. So,
yes,
I started doing things with Access, and people come to me with their Access applications that have grown to run their business, and they're a bit of a mess, and I sort them out. Or I see other businesses where there is no standard process in the organisation. Everyone in the organisation works in a different way, and they all have their own spreadsheets. And working with the owner, we kind of pull it all into one process, and that's in a database with an Access front end, and standardises or systematizes their business, which you can't do in Excel.
true.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'm Kevin. I've been working with Access since version 1 in a bunch of different varieties, mostly consulting, kind of like with small businesses. The majority of what we do or did on my first round was SQL Server on the back end, Access on the front end. I ended up working with the Access team on 2010, 2013, and part of 2016. Now back to kind of semi-consulting. I've got some add-ins.
There's a good presentation too. At some point. Jack?
No, the host, you don't have your name. I think, is it Ken?
No, well, I'm George Hepworth. I'm sorry. I
George,
didn't-
George, that's right. I'm not good at remembering emails. So I joined a little late. Are we just doing a round table here? And
Yeah, just real quick. As I was explaining, what happens is
Uh,
we have six
George.
people, but the whole,
Barely audible. Well, might be my end.
anybody else not hearing me?
Yeah, you're really quiet.
Jack, you're really loud.
That's
Okay.
it about
Sort of in the
WebEx.
middle.
Well,
WebEx
maybe that's
has
the
a
Canadian in
closed
me.
caption. WebEx has a closed caption, so you might want to turn that on. It makes things easier.
Is that any better? I put the microphone right in front of my mouth.
That's good.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that.
Closed captioning too.
So, Jack, I live just out of Vancouver, BC. Been using Access, Kent, I heard you say version 2. I think the version I bought was 1.1. I remember the code name, I think, was Cirrus, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I've been using it a long time, not professionally. It's always off the side of my desk through my regular work, but I do have a big project that I'm currently upsizing from an Access backend to SQL Server. So that's keeping me busy during COVID. I'm a retired guy, but it's nice to have this to do a bit of work on.
Okay, great. Great. Well, hopefully we'll have something for you tonight.
Yeah, I was looking forward to Juan talking about his stuff, and I've discovered a couple of his blogs and whatnot. So
Yeah,
a couple of questions for him.
unfortunately, when I checked in today to see what his plans were, he had an emergency. He's the president of his company, and I think he was putting out a fire or something today, so he
Yeah.
was not able to. He's going to reschedule, hopefully soon. So, Tom, next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom. So I kind of wanted to just be a fly on the wall and hope that George would pass me up. But
No, well, that's enough. Yeah, I will tell
Yeah.
you, Tom is also a former Access MVP,
Good.
so
Yeah.
he knows his
Well.
stuff.
Anywho,
Too much, Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Herr, and I teach at a community college, Access, that is. And I'm also interested in converting the back end of Access database to SQL. And I'm not sure, since there was an emergency, what's going to happen tonight. Are we going to talk about that, or are we going to talk about something else?
Right, I'm going to jump in. As I've said before you joined, I had this little presentation that I'd been thinking about for a while, and when Juan was not able to join us, I kind of fleshed it out a little bit. It won't take the full time, but it'll give us something to talk about for at least part of the time. And so with that, I guess what I'll do is share my screen and jump in. And what I'm going to talk about is, okay, go away. WebEx is interfering with my screen. Okay. I'm going to talk about, I should go back to screen 1, shouldn't I? I'm going to talk about using SQL Server security with no saved login information. Login is required. It's always required, but credentials are not stored. A little bit about me. I'm the leader of this particular chapter of the Access user groups, currently on the core admin team at Utter Access. Worked on several books with other authors, and I'm also a former Access MVP. And I'm very happily retired because it means I can do whatever I want, whenever I want with Access or Power Apps or SQL Server or whatever takes my fancy. The foundational article on which this presentation is drawn was written by Ben Clothier. See if it'll It's now 10 years old, but he talked about the problem of storing passwords in connection strings and how to get around that. So I'll post the link to this article in the comments on this video or on the YouTube video so you can look it up. But basically everything that I wanted to talk about, he presented here originally. It's based on the assumption that, or based on the fact that Access caches connections. So
By the way, if anyone's interested, I used Ben's code and I converted it to work for Oracle. When I attempted to convert it for Teradata, I fell flat on my face. I couldn't figure it out. And of
well,
course,
that's the follow-up to this session then, right?
yeah. When I tried to get help from Teradata, of course, I needed an account number and all that good stuff. So
Yeah, those guys are pretty big. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the important thing to remember is that this is strictly SQL Server authentication. It doesn't have anything to do with Windows authentication. And I think we can have a discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of both of those too. But with Windows authentication, you're using the Windows account, which you log into your Windows system with to authenticate from there into SQL Server. With SQL Server authentication, you supply a second set of credentials specifically for SQL Server. And that's what we're going to talk about here with the cached connection. I see this as primarily cases where you've got remotely hosted servers in SQL Azure or on a small peer-to-peer network, which is not on a Windows domain. And in my career, I worked with 2 or 3 small businesses where, in fact, they only did have peer-to-peer networks. And so I know that those exist. They're not as common as they once were probably, but they still exist. So what happens when you link your Access front end to a SQL Server database? Lights are flashing, which is often a prelude to a power outage. So if I suddenly disappear, it's been nice talking to you. Crossing my fingers here. When you link your tables, and this is a SQL Server database on my local computer, you have the option to save the password or not save the password. If you do not check the save password option, then when you create the connections, they are only valid as long as that session of Access is open, not saved as part of the connection or that set of linked tables. However, as Ben pointed out in his article, there is an interesting behavior in Access, and we can take advantage of it. When Access opens an ODBC connection, it caches that connection, and then any subsequent ODBC objects, tables, views, or pass-throughs, which match on 3 of those parameters, will reuse that cached connection. So if the ODBC driver matches, the server and the database match, Access will reuse that same cached connection to reconnect again. This behavior persists until Access itself closes. It's not tied to the ACCDB cached in Access. Because Access does cache the connection, any subsequent ODBC objects that match will reuse that cached connection. So the scenario may or may not be very likely, but the one that came to my mind was if you close the current ACCDB, leave Access itself running, walk away, get a cup of coffee or whatever, go to lunch. Later, you or anyone else sitting down at your computer can use that same set of credentials, the same set of cached credentials, to reconnect to that same ACCDB without ever having to log on again. So that's the downside. And I set up a little relational database application to demo that. Start it. This is an Access front end sitting on my laptop in front of me. Tables are sitting on a SQL Server database on the computer behind me, peer-to-peer network. If I try to open them, I get this little dialog, and it indicates the name of the server, which is the big box, and it offers the default login. Don't ask me how I misspelled my own name in my Windows account. It just happened, okay? But it offers by default my Windows login and a blank password. I can supply the valid credentials here and connect.
Finally.
David.
Hello, young man.
Hey,
How you
David.
doing?
Hi,
George,
glad you could join us.
I've been trying for 15 minutes to get in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, at least you're here now. So
Yeah.
we're into the presentation a little ways. If
Okay.
you can catch up by checking out the video later.
Okay.
So I put in my credentials, and this is a user that I created for this database, and it connects, and then that table opens. And that will work, and you can have your users do that, but it's really not a very user-friendly experience. So I created this little login screen to do that. Now, the interesting thing is, now that I have logged in once, I don't have to log in again. Let's see. Does this ever happen to you? You set a breakpoint. I call them the phantom breakpoints, and then later they're still there when you don't want them.
Yeah, why on earth won't they fix that? That's been going on for decades.
For decades, yes. It just annoys me.
Do a decompile to eliminate it.
Yeah, what I do is I just edit. I just insert a blank line and remove it, and then decompile, and that gets rid of it. But I obviously forgot. But as you can see, because I logged in once correctly, even though I passed a connection string with no user ID and password, it still has the cached connection that it used. So I'm going to close this. And because Access itself remained open, the cached connection is still valid. If I close Access itself and restart it, now that cached connection is gone, and I will get an error. Sorry about that. So now my login routine is telling me that I did not supply the user ID and password. So let's very quickly look at the code that makes all of that happen. Really pretty simple, and it's based on Ben's article. Although I did add a few flourishes of my own. First thing we do is we attempt to connect using 4 pieces of information: the server, the database, the user ID, and the password. And as you can see from the naming convention, these are 4 controls on the form. 2 of those controls are hidden: the server and the database. Now, I hard-coded the name of the server in this hidden control, and I hard-coded the name of the database in this hidden control. I went back and forth. I thought, somebody who knows what they're doing, they're going to open this form in Design View, and they're going to find that. They're going to know the name of the database, and they're going to know the name of the server. But really, what have I lost by having them know that information. They still need the credentials to log into it. So it's probably, you can take that to another level and hide those better. But for better or worse, people, they're authorized to use your database. They probably need to know the name of it, or they probably do know the name. So the user ID should get the same error because we're missing even though the connection string now contains the user ID, we're missing the password. And you can use the input mask to hide that password, but I didn't bother to do that. And it runs through and validates, and now we're connected. So let's go back time.
Hey, George, maybe you know the answer to this, but I noticed in that little dialogue that showed your connection string, one of the options was encrypt equals no.
Yes.
Is it possible to make this code work with an encrypted connection so that if I were, say, over at your home and I happen to be sniffing your line with Wireshark, I wouldn't see your password proudly presented in a trace?
Yes, you can encrypt. I will get to that, hopefully, before we're done.
Yeah, because that's the one thing I've never tried.
I haven't tried it here. I know that when you connect to SQL Azure, you must use an encrypted connection. And I haven't really tried it here. We can try it.
Yeah, I see your encrypt equals no right there in your string.
But
Huh.
actually, let's step through the rest of it. Let's step through the code, and we'll address that. It's in here, but I hadn't called it out yet. So I'll put the breakpoint back on there. Go back here. Do it. And now I've done it. Actually, I'm going to close this and restart it because now that is saved. Yeah, that's the pain of doing it this way, is that I have to actually close access to reset that cached connection, and that takes a bit more time. And I want to do something else too. I want to check this. This is a feature. Okay, so go into the code. I've whined about this before, but when I have meeting software hooked up, everything runs slower. It seems to consume a lot of resources. So now if I type in G, well, it's going to pass the server, the database, the user ID, the password, and false. So the function takes those 4 parameters plus the optional encrypt. So that's what Tom was just talking about. I was looking at this earlier today and thinking, I could make this work better by taking out the if statement and simply replacing the encrypt here. But then I thought, what's going to happen is if you start messing with something that works an hour before the meeting, it will not work at all. So I'm going to do this later, but I think what I can do is rewrite this very easily to just pass encrypt yes or no. What we're doing now is we're deciding which one we're going to go through. Pick this one. So it's going to set up the connection string using the driver. Trusted connection is no. If it was a Windows authentication, that would be trusted connection equals yes. The server, the database, username, and password. And then I open that little screen, little form. Getting extra help from WebEx here, so bear with me for a second while I can get to my toolbar. You can't see what I'm doing, but there, WebEx has popped a toolbar right over where I need to be. Sorry about that. That opens that little form and pastes the connection string into the text box. Then we create a temporary query def. I don't think I like WebEx anymore. Every time I get near that, it pops this little helper screen down. So you want to learn a new bad word? I move my mouse very carefully. I don't activate it. So we set up the temporary query def. We give it the connection string we just created. And now we're going to select options from SQL Server. Now options just returns a bitmap of the options enabled on that particular instance. And the only reason to do that is if I get a response back, I know that I've got a live connection. If I get no response, then I know I didn't make a connection. And so my credentials are bad. That's the only reason to do this. It's a very simple, short, quick query. Open the record set on it, close it. It worked, so I am able to connect. True. And that means my credentials that I just gave it are correct. And theoretically, I could stop right here and start working with my tables, because now that I've made that connection, it's cached. I can go ahead, but I decided to make this a little more sophisticated, or at least I think it's a little more sophisticated. I checked to see if this is the first time I've run this on this new database. If it is the first time, then I want to standardize the structure of my connection string. When I was working on this, connection string can end up with 2 or 3 different flavors. And it was driving me nuts because I wanted to see them all consistent. So I just added this so that I'm going to regularize or normalize or synchronize all of the connection strings in all the tables. And that's all this does. It looks up the app name, which is coded in that same table. And then it runs through all of the table defs in database, checks to see if it's an ODBC connection, prints that. That's just a debugging technique. Then it creates the connection in the format that I want, which is the description, the driver, the server, trust connection, no, the app equals string app. This is an optional part. Names the database, puts the encrypt no, puts the user ID and password in that order, and that's the way I wanted them. I think you could shuffle those around. I like to see them the same way every time. It's easier for me to recognize when something's right or wrong. So I will just simply zip on through. And then the last step, which I overwrote by going that quickly, was it sets my first time run to no so that it won't run that again. And that's really all there is to it.
Nice.
So the idea again is, you can set it up so that your users have to supply credentials to use your SQL Server database using SQL Server authentication. But you give them a little nicer experience. So any questions, comments, suggestions?
Well, it's really interesting the way it caches for the Access application rather than your individual application. I never would have realized that.
Yeah, that was one of the trickier things and once I got my head wrapped around that, it made a lot of things make more sense. And as I showed you already, I can actually close this, open a totally different database, or Access front end. And this one has the same issue. I would have to supply the credentials to get into it because they're not stored, but because it's a different database and it doesn't match the cached connection, I have to do that. But if I go back and reopen this one, bingo, bango, bongo, we're back in. You cached in that. So that's why I said in my slide, this is a good thing or a bad thing. Because unless you actually close Access, those credentials are cached. Now, I don't know, and maybe Kevin does, or Tom. I don't know if you cache a different set of credentials, whether it would overwrite these or whether it would still work. Frankly, that didn't occur to me until just this second. So if I okay, let me see.
So your Windows, sorry, your users in SQL Server, is that in the instance security or is it in the database security? The database permissions.
Which user are you?
So when you're logging on as this user with this password,
This is in SQL Server, yeah.
but it's
Let me
not
wrap this up
specific to the database, it's specific to the instance.
Okay, this one is specific to the instance. That AUG demo is specific to that database. I should show that next. Yeah, you're right. I should show you that. Let me test this out and see what happens, because now I've cached a different set of credentials. Not sure if what will happen here. Yeah. Yeah, so they're still there. Even though I put in a different set of credentials for the other database.
Well, I suppose if you've got one application that's connected to more than one SQL database at the same time, so you've got tables linked to different databases, it would need to cache the multiple.
Yeah, it would cache them all, apparently. So that's something for me to test. Like I say, I didn't even think about that until just now, but that's another potential complication. Yeah. So this is the database that I created for this demo, and I'm logged in under that login. If I try to open any of these other databases, nothing happens. That's even more puzzling because earlier I was getting an error. Now it's just not doing anything. Database is not accessible. And now it's refusing. Okay, so the first time I try to get to it, I get the error message, but this is the only one that's available because of those credentials. What else were we going to look at here? That's it. Oh, there's the options. Which returns that number, which is a bitmap indicating which options are set on instance. Any other comments or questions or observations?
Well, typically on that first connection, I'm looking for the back end version so I can compare it to the front end version. And
Yeah,
if
now this would have to be integrated with whatever other startup code you run.
Mm.
And it is, as all demos are, tailored to work perfectly without complications, which is not what you see in real world situations. If I look at the connections, you can see that this is looking at my MSys objects, and there is no cached or stored information. And this is why I say I like to see these strings in the same format, because I know they look the same, and I can just scan them quickly and see that they're all matching. But none of them have the user ID or password stored.
Mm.
So I guess the last step would be to either train users to close access completely or somehow close access down after a waiting period. And I've seen code that does that to prevent that cached connection from coming back to bite you.
And there's no VBA command or whatever you can use to clear out that cached connection?
That's another good question that I hadn't considered.
Because again, you know, when your splash screen closes, and because it's hidden, it closes when the application closes, you can run a bit of code then, but
yeah, I don't know. That's a good one to follow up on, to see. Because I know.
Well, Ben didn't know the answer to that.
Who will?
Ben.
Ben will know. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll know. Yeah. I'm going to try this now. Now that I've verified that the cached connection for the first one still works. The cached connection for this one still works. It's a bad move because that's the connection string to my website. Picked a bad sample, didn't I?
What were we looking at in the MSys object?
Let's go back to. Okay. MSys objects contains list of all the objects in the database.
Yeah.
One of the properties is the connection. So I'm just filtering it on those connections which are not null. If I show them all.
But those connections will be there even before you've actually given the password and connected.
Right, because
the connection string stored from the last time.
Yeah, and this is the one that I store by default. You can see, like I said before, I want it with the description, the driver, server, and so on. I want it in this format. So when I'm looking at it in any given database, I don't have to stop and say, now where's the driver in this one? Where's the database? They're all laid out the same way. But the connect property stores that information. This is a local table. It has no connection. The foreign name, that's the name of the table in SQL Server. So on. And there's other information. This is the part that's mostly of interest to me.
See, typically I have a little table that's got 3 different connections, one for production, one for test, and one for development. So depending on which environment it.
Yeah, and instead of, you could modify this to pull the right set, like I'm doing here.
And because the the password is stored for the database, not the instance, you could have it set up so that the developer can't access the production database and your average user can't accidentally connect to the test or the development database. That would be a good.
Yeah, see this little table, this frankly was a very recent idea, and I'm thinking that I could do this, what you were just saying, I could expand this to contain development, test, and production. And depending on what I wanted to pull the right connection string out of it. Instead of supplying it this way, yeah. Or actually, or the database, the server and database anyway. You can move
using
that up.
driver 17. Okay.
That would be a nice enhancement to make this more flexible because, but then you would have to tailor the front end to the purpose for the user. I don't think you would want to trust the user.
Well, typically what I do is in my development folder where the front end is, I have a dev.txt. In the test folder, there's a test.txt. And if there's nothing, then it assumes you're in production.
Okay,
So the little splash screen goes, is there a dev.txt? Okay, well, let's connect to the production database.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, I'm thinking about a way to enhance this to do something similar to that. Yeah.
And because your passwords you can have by database, you can make sure that somebody doesn't accidentally connect to the wrong one.
So if you say I'm going to connect to test and they supply a production
password, I won't get in.
Won't get in, yeah.
That's nice.
That would be handy, yeah. That's another announcement that could be made. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But then the problem is that my production database and my test database are restores from my development database and test database are restores from a production database. So they'll inherit the permissions from the production database when I restore.
Yeah, so, you would actually have to run a script on those databases to change that.
So one of the things I've done in the past is on that startup, you're running, code against SQL just to say, can I connect to the SQL server? Right? Like you had your connection string. So what I've done is I'll pick a table that's a simple lookup table, and I'll go get the connection string that's in Access, which doesn't have the username, it doesn't have the password. And then I'll say, okay, connect to that and give me a count on that table. And if it's linked to production, it goes to production. If it's linked to test, it goes to test. If it's linked to development, it goes to development. So, usually you're going to relink your tables ahead of time. Certainly with Azure, because it's slow to do that, and you don't really want the user to have to sit through, relinking the table every time. So I'll relink the table, and that automatically sets it up so that it's on the right table. And assuming I relink all the tables, but if I didn't relink all the tables, I've got a mess anyways, because I'm now talking to two different databases.
Well, you'd relink the tables before you actually distributed the front end to users. Right. So,
yeah, well, that's the hope, anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would. Yeah, the front end that you distribute would be under your control to give them the right version. Yeah.
So I'll just pick a very simple lookup table, or if you've got a configuration table, something that's on that SQL server. I'll just say, what's your current connection string? And then use that. So you don't have to do the, account on the table. I've done a select 1 = 1 works on Or I forget what but there's something that'll work on Oracle, or it works on a bunch of different things that will fail if you don't have a connection. But if you have a connection, it just says, well, of course, 1 equals 1.
Well, so I use that for two purposes. It's to make sure you've got a connection, but also returns the version number, so that if the front end is a lower version than the back end number, it tells them they've got to do an update.
Sorry.
So there's just that little table, the back end version table in each database that's only got the one record, and it's the record of the back end version.
Okay, so I'm going to solicit input in email from both of you on these ideas, because I would like to enhance this a little bit. And I see Bob Larson has joined us. Is that you, Bob?
Yeah, I've been here for probably a good 40 minutes or so.
It's good talking to you. Now, Bob Larson and I worked together in Portland. It's pretty close to 100 years ago.
2009 or 2000,
2009, yeah.
2008 actually, I think it was.
Yeah.
Well, so I've got one client who's using a peer-to-peer network, and using Windows authentications used to work all right, but I think when Windows deprecated Workgroup in peer-to-peer networks, it seems to have made it a lot more difficult.
Yeah. I basically have just two computers and a peer-to-peer network. They're both cabled, so that it's really easy for me to replicate this environment. But yeah, I worked in an office where they did that. They were too cheap to put in a Windows server. The whole office was peer-to-peer, and it worked pretty well.
Well, I'm not too cheap. I actually bought a server, but then I tried to set up, and I decided, no, that's what IT people are for. It's too hard. What do you mean I've got to have a separate server for AD and a separate server for remote RDS gateway and a separate server? Too hard.
So real quick, now I'm curious, Bob, what are you up to these days?
Well, actually, I'm I spent the last almost 10 years at PNC Bank, but got my job went away last October, so I'd been unemployed for the last year or so. Just started at a place called Greenbrier. They do rail car stuff. I'm doing a contract to hire thing. I'm doing SQL Server, SSRS development type stuff. And we'll probably be working with them on doing some transitioning from Access to SQL stuff as well eventually. And then probably getting into more of the Power BI stuff. But yeah, so I started at PNC there back in 2009 and was doing Access development for them. And then they went to a web app, and we had to convert it all over to SSRS. And the Access stuff that we did there with it, we did using what to call it? Man, it's like I'm losing it. My brain is not with it. Can't think of the terminology. It's like it's right on the tip of my tongue, but
what were you using it for?
So what we did was we had a SQL Server app, or we had basically a VB6 app that was SQL Server based backend, and we were doing access reporting. So we had about 6 access databases that were doing all the reporting out of that system, and but we had to use it's the virtualization type thing that I can't remember the brand, the name of it.
VMware?
No, it was Oh, well, this really.
What was this, to
Getting
host your
it.
Access
So,
applications?
what's that?
Was that to host the Access applications so people could get at them over the web, or?
Yeah. So, well, it was so they could access them at all because they did not want access on people's computers. So
So
it
using
was
some sort of remote app.
Some kind of
yeah.
remote.
It started with an S, I think. It's really it's
Not
popular with it.
Citrix.
Citrix, it's C, yeah. So that's an S, right? No, like
Citrix.
Yeah.
Citrix.
Well, that's
Citrix.
why I
Sounded like it.
tweaked.
Yeah,
Citrix.
right.
Citrix, yeah.
Yeah, so it was using Citrix for the front ends, and then the SQL Server back end. It was all Windows authentication, and but the benefit to the Citrix app was that we could basically put the one app in front end in place, and then it would be available to everybody, and not be using the same front end exactly. And George knows that I actually created a tool that's still out there. Juan put it on a site for me out there. It's my front end auto enabling tool.
Oh,
So
that's on one site?
yeah, that's just btabdevelopment.com
Oh,
is
that's right. I
still
forgot. Yeah.
still my thing. But he put it up for me because I couldn't
Yeah.
maintain it. But the
Juan
tools are
maintained it.
still But the
Forgot
tools
that.
are still out there, and it also still has the front end auto updating for use with the SQL Server backend as well. So
To go check
those are
that out.
still.
So what's it called? Where we find it?
So it's at www.btabdevelopment.com. So B as in boy, T as in Tom, A as in Adam, B as in boy, development. It's all one word. And it's under the tools section.
We used that at Nike, didn't we?
Yeah. I think we used it there. We used it also. Well, I used it at Providence too. That's actually where I created it, because they didn't want us to have. They were like, when I told them that they need to have a separate front end on everybody's computer, they were saying, "You're crazy. You're nuts." And I was telling them that's why it's corrupting. Is that
Yes.
you're trying to use 150 people using a single front end. Ooh.
We've all had that conversation, right? So I also see David joined us. So David, just a quick refresher who you are and what your connection to Access is. I know David has actually presented to the group in the past, but for
Okay,
our
I'm Dave Neely. I'm in Denver, Colorado, and I'm really not a developer. I'm a business person. So I try to make my applications as user-friendly as possible using graphics and speech. That's it.
So we've got a really wide variety of experiences and connections to Access. It's pretty cool. Okie doke. Well, like I said before, I don't know if you were all here at the beginning. Hopefully Juan will be able to do his presentation either December or January. And he's going to talk about optimizing SQL and Access. And if I get some good feedback, hint, hint, I can probably polish this little presentation up and post it on my website as a download. Not sure how we'll do the best. I'd like to make it a little more complete and as possible. So is there anything else you guys want to talk about before we call it a night?
Well, I was just going to say if you can hang out for just a short time afterwards, I'll talk to you and tell you something.
Oh, sure.
But I don't want to
sure.
bore everybody with that yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you joined us. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Yeah. So in the other thing the other big thing that's dangling is Microsoft announced connector for Dataverse for Access this week. Hopefully we'll be able to get someone from Microsoft to come and present here on what that means for Access developers. I think we all have an interest.
What would
Not
it
sure
connect
how.
to?
Sorry?
What would it connect to?
Dataverse.
Dataverse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So your homework for this month is to figure out what the heck Dataverse is.
Exactly. Writing it down.
I'm
If Microsoft is doing it, it probably won't work, but then what can I tell you?
we'll see what it boils down to.
But I'm glad they're thinking of it, you know?
You're so cynical, like me.
Well, my response, and I'm trying. See, I'm trying to talk the guy into coming and presenting. So I'm going to hold off my thoughts until I hear firsthand what it really is and how it works.
Thank you for putting together the presentation on such short notice.
Well, I appreciate it. It really wasn't. I mean, I had the whole idea in my head, and
No, but I know it takes time and thought, and I appreciate it.
but as you can see, there isn't a whole lot to it, and it's totally based on Ben's article. So,
But still,
but it's a way to kind of get us
Take
thinking
credit.
beyond.
Take credit. What I tell people is take credit for things you didn't do because you're going to get blamed for things you didn't do.
Well, I have a story about that, but that
Tell
comes
us.
back to bite you, Linda.
But thank you, really.
Welcome. I was happy to do it. I had fun doing it, and we made it through without any weather delays.
Okay.
Okay, well, I guess we can call it a night, and I'll see you all next month.
Yep.
I'll
You
stop
will.
the recording.
Thanks very much, George.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Talk to you soon.